Hey guys, tonight I want you to imagine something very simple. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and realizing that there is no furnace in your house, no central heating, no electric blanket, no thermostat on the wall, no warm car waiting outside, and no button you can press to make the entire room warm again. Outside your small house, snow is falling quietly. The wind is moving across the fields. The windows are covered with frost. And somewhere beyond the walls, the temperature is dropping lower and lower. You pull your blanket closer. You move toward the small fire. And you realize that this little fire is the difference between being uncomfortable and being dangerously cold. For most of human history, winter was not simply a beautiful season. It was something people prepared for months in advance. A successful harvest could mean warmth and full stomachs. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A well-built house could protect a family from the wind. A badly prepared house could turn an ordinary winter night into a very difficult one. But somehow, people survived. Generation after generation, century after century. Long before modern heating systems, people developed clever ways to keep themselves warm. They changed the way they built houses. They changed the way they slept. They stored enormous amounts of food. They dried wood. They made heavier clothing. They shared warmth. They changed their daily routines. And sometimes, they simply learned how to live with the cold. So tonight, we're going to travel slowly through that world. A world of fireplaces and smoky rooms, of wool blankets and wooden walls, of frozen mornings, quiet villages, dark winter evenings, and long nights spent beside a small fire. We'll begin with the simplest question. How did people actually stay warm? And as we move through the night, we'll discover that surviving winter wasn't about one amazing invention. It was about hundreds of small decisions. Where you built your house, what you wore, what you ate, how you slept, what you burned, who you lived with, and how carefully you prepared before the first snow arrived. So get comfortable, lower the lights, put your phone somewhere nearby, but out of reach, and let yourself slowly enter a colder world. A world before modern heating. A world where winter was something every family understood. Take a slow breath, and let's begin. Winter survival actually began long before winter. In many parts of Europe and North America, people understood that the cold months were coming months in advance. They could see it in the shortening days. They could feel it in the morning air. They could watch the leaves changing color. And they knew that the comfortable days of summer were slowly disappearing. There was no weather app to tell them exactly when the first major snowstorm would arrive. There were no modern forecasts. Instead, people relied on experience. Farmers watched the sky. Hunters watched animals. Communities remembered what previous winters had been like. And older people often carried knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Winter preparation was almost like a second harvest. The summer and autumn months were busy. Very busy. There was food to preserve, grain to store, vegetables to dry, meat to salt, fruit to preserve, and perhaps most importantly, fuel to collect. Wood was one of the most valuable things a household could have. A forest might look endless from a distance, but firewood had to be cut. It had to be transported. It had to be split. And then it had to be stored somewhere dry. A family that entered winter with too little firewood had a serious problem. Because once the snow became deep, collecting more wood could become extremely difficult. So during the warmer months, people spent countless hours preparing. Men, women, and children could all have responsibilities. Some chopped wood, some carried branches, some prepared food, some repaired roofs, some patched walls, some made clothing, and some simply learned the practical skills that would help the household survive. This was not glamorous work. It was repetitive. It was tiring, but it was essential. In a world without central heating, preparations was the heating system. The work done in September might save you in January. A pile of dry wood beside the house represented warmth several months in the future. A sack of grain represented meals that had not yet been eaten. A thick wool blanket represented nights that had not yet arrived. People were constantly preparing for a future they could not control. And perhaps that is one of the most interesting things about winter life. Modern people often think of comfort as something we can simply switch on. But earlier, people thought about comfort as something they had to prepare. The heart of many winter homes was the fire. For thousands of years, humans had used fire for warmth, cooking, light, and protection. But by the medieval period and later centuries, fireplaces became an important part of domestic life in many regions. A fireplace was not simply a source of heat. It was the center of the household. People cooked beside it. They ate beside it. They repaired tools beside it. They talked beside it. They told stories beside it. And during winter evenings, they watched it. A fire has a strange ability to make a room feel alive. The flames move. The wood cracks. Smoke rises. Light moves across the walls. And in a world without electric lights, the fire was often the brightest thing inside the house. But fireplaces were not perfect. A large open fire could lose a tremendous amount of heat through the chimney. Smoke could also be a problem. Depending on the building design, indoor air could become smoky. Eyes could sting. Walls could become darkened by soot. Clothing could smell strongly of smoke. Yet people accepted these problems because the fire was necessary. There were different approaches in different regions. Some homes had central hearths. Some had fireplaces built against walls. Some had more advanced masonry heating systems. In Northern Europe, enclosed stoves eventually became particularly important because they could retain and distribute heat more efficiently than an open fire. But for ordinary families, the basic principle remained simple. Burn something. Create heat. Stay close. And try not to waste it. That last part was important. People did not heat an entire house evenly. Instead, they often concentrated their activities around the warmest area. The room containing the fire became the living room in the most literal sense, the place where people lived. The rest of the house might remain much colder. Imagine walking away from the fire. A few steps farther, the warmth begins to disappear. Another room might feel almost as cold as the outdoors. This meant that people learned to live in small zones of warmth. The warmest place was valuable, and during the coldest nights, people stayed close together. The next secret to surviving winter was the house. Before modern insulation, people still understood something very important. A good building could protect you from the weather. Different cultures developed different architectural solutions. In northern regions, houses often used thick walls, smaller openings, low ceilings, and materials that helped reduce heat loss. Wood was common in heavily forested areas. Stone and earth were used in other regions. Some houses were partly built into the ground. This might sound strange today, but the ground has a remarkably stable temperature compared with the rapidly changing air above it. A partly underground shelter could be protected from strong winds and extreme temperature changes. In some regions, people also used earth, clay, straw, or other materials to fill gaps in walls. The goal was simple: stop the wind, because wind was one of winter's greatest enemies. A house did not necessarily need to be warm. It needed to be less cold than outside. That was already a major victory. Think about a winter night on an open field. The wind moves freely. There is nothing between your body and the cold air. Now imagine stepping inside a small wooden house. The walls block the wind. The roof blocks the snow. The fire creates warmth. Even if the room is still cold, it is a completely different environment. This was the basic philosophy of traditional winter architecture. You didn't have to create summer. You simply had to create shelter. One thing you might notice when looking at older houses is the windows. Many traditional homes had much smaller windows than modern houses. This was partly because glass was expensive and difficult to produce in earlier periods. But smaller openings also had a practical advantage. They allowed less heat to escape. Large modern windows are beautiful. They let sunlight into our homes. But glass is not a perfect barrier against cold. Earlier builders had to think carefully about openings. A window was useful during the day. But at night, it was a place where heat could escape. So shutters became important. Heavy wooden shutters could be closed during cold nights. Curtains and other coverings could provide additional protection. Some windows were made with small panes. Others used materials such as oiled cloth or animal membranes before affordable glass became widespread. Others used materials such as oiled cloth or animal membranes before affordable glass became widespread. The room glows orange. The corners disappear into shadow. Outside, snow reflects a little moonlight. Inside, people sit close to the fire. The darkness itself becomes part of winter life. And eventually, everyone goes to sleep. If your house was cold, your clothing became extremely important. Today, we often think of clothing as fashion. For earlier people, especially those living in cold climates, clothing was also technology. Layers mattered. Wool was especially valuable because it could retain warmth even when damp. People used wool, linen, leather, fur, and other natural materials depending on region, wealth, and availability. The idea was not simply to wear one extremely thick piece of clothing. Instead, people could use layers: a base layer, a middle layer, an outer layer, additional coverings when necessary. Head coverings were important too. So were gloves and footwear. The feet were particularly vulnerable to cold because they were often in contact with cold ground. People therefore used different kinds of socks, wrapped cloth around their feet, and wore shoes or boots appropriate to their environment. At night, clothing could sometimes remain important. People did not always sleep in modern-style pajamas. They slept in garments and coverings appropriate to the period. Blankets, quilts, wool coverings, and fur could provide additional warmth. And there was another trick. Don't make the bed too large. A smaller sleeping space was easier to warm with body heat. This leads us to one of the most interesting parts of winter life: the bed itself. Imagine climbing into bed on a freezing night. There is no heated mattress, no electric blanket, no thermostat. The sheets feel cold. The room is cold. And the air around your face is cold. So how do you make yourself comfortable? The answer was layers. People use blankets, quilts, wool, feathers, straw mattresses, and other materials depending on place and wealth. Feather beds were particularly valued in some societies. A thick layer of feathers could provide insulation and comfort. But not everyone could afford such luxury. Poorer households used simpler materials. Straw mattresses were common in various historical periods. They were not soft in the modern sense, but they provided a layer between the body and the cold floor, and that mattered. A bed placed directly against a cold surface could lose heat rapidly, so even a simple mattress could make a difference. People also learned something very basic. Warmth is easier to keep than to create. If you enter bed already warm, your blankets have an easier job. If you enter bed freezing, it may take much longer to become comfortable. This is one reason people often spent the final part of the evening near the fire. They prepared themselves for sleep. Then they carried that warmth into bed. For wealthy households, there was another fascinating solution. Bed curtains. A large four-poster bed could be surrounded by thick fabric curtains. These curtains were not merely decorative. They created a smaller enclosed space. The curtains reduced drafts. They helped retain body heat. And they gave sleepers a little private world inside the larger room. Imagine a huge stone bedroom in winter. The ceiling is high. The walls are cold. The fireplace is several meters away. The room itself may be uncomfortable. But inside the bed curtains, the space is smaller. Your body warms the air around you. The fabric slows the movement of cold air. The blankets trap more heat. Suddenly, the bed becomes its own little climate. This was a clever example of traditional thermal design. Instead of heating the entire room, you heat the person, or more accurately, you help the person heat a much smaller space. For modern people, personal space is often considered important. Bedrooms, separate beds, separate blankets, sometimes even separate rooms. Earlier households could be very different. In many homes, several people slept in the same room. Sometimes multiple people shared sleeping spaces. This was not necessarily about comfort. It was practical. Every human body produces heat. Several people in a small enclosed space can therefore make the environment warmer. Family members could sleep near one another. In some societies, servants and workers also slept in shared spaces. Animals could sometimes be housed nearby as well, particularly in agricultural buildings. A traditional winter household could therefore become a surprisingly communal place. The goal was not perfect privacy. The goal was survival and practicality. Winter encouraged people to stay together, and that changed social life. Long winter evenings became opportunities for conversation. People repaired clothing. They made tools. They told stories. They played simple games. They sang. They discussed work. And eventually, they slept. Winter did not mean people stopped working. Farmers still had tasks. Animals needed care. Tools needed repair. Clothing needed mending. Wood needed cutting. Food needed preparation. People worked with whatever daylight was available. In some agricultural communities, winter was a period when outdoor work slowed down. That created opportunities for indoor crafts: spinning, weaving, carpentry, leatherwork, metalwork, repairing equipment. The winter months could therefore become a different kind of productive season. Summer was associated with fields and sunlight. Winter was associated with indoor work and firelight. The rhythm of life followed the seasons. Today, artificial lighting allows us to work almost any hour. Earlier, people were more closely tied to natural light. That connection shaped daily routines. Winter nights were long, very long. Without electric lights, there was little reason to remain awake late unless there was work to do. Darkness encouraged earlier bedtimes. But the night could still be noisy. Wind could move around the building. Rain could strike the roof. Snow could slide from the roof. Wood could crack in the fire. Animals could make sounds outside. A person lying in bed could hear almost everything. And there was no glowing smartphone beside the pillow. No television. No refrigerator humming in the kitchen. No cars moving down a distant highway. Just darkness, firelight, wind, and breathing. Perhaps this is one reason historical winter nights can feel so peaceful when we imagine them today. The world was quieter, not necessarily safer, not necessarily easier, but quieter. There was another detail that could determine how comfortable a winter would be: the condition of the firewood. Freshly cut wood contains moisture. Wet wood burns poorly. It produces more smoke. Dry wood burns more efficiently. So people had to prepare firewood ahead of time. Logs were cut and stacked. They were kept under shelter when possible. The longer they could dry, the better. A household might therefore spend weeks or months building a wood supply. Every log represented future warmth, and people learned not to waste it. A fire was not necessarily kept blazing at full strength all night. Fuel was limited. Instead, people managed it. They added wood when needed. They protected the embers. They used the remaining heat. And in the morning, they tried to revive the fire. Imagine waking before sunrise. The room is dark. The fire from last night has almost disappeared. You approach the hearth. There are only a few glowing embers. You carefully add dry material. A tiny flame appears. Then another. Slowly, the fire returns. And with it, the room begins to warm. Winter meals were often simple, and that was perfectly reasonable. A large pot could be placed near the fire. Grain, vegetables, beans, meat, and whatever else was available could be combined. The result was a warm meal. Soup and stew had several advantages. They were relatively economical. They could feed several people. They used ingredients that were easy to store. And perhaps most importantly, they were warm. A bowl of hot food on a cold evening could provide psychological comfort as well as physical warmth. Imagine holding a wooden bowl in your hands. Steam rises from the surface. The fire is burning nearby. Outside, the wind moves across the roof. Inside, you have food. You have shelter. You have people around you. For a moment, winter does not seem quite so frightening. Winter survival was not only about external warmth. Food mattered enormously. The human body needs energy to maintain its temperature. And in cold conditions, food became especially important. But winter created another problem. Fresh food could become difficult to obtain. So people spent months preserving food before winter arrived. Grain was one of the most important staples. Wheat, barley, rye, oats. Depending on the region, grain could be stored for long periods if kept dry. It could later become bread, porridge, or other meals. Root vegetables were also valuable. Potatoes became especially important in some parts of Europe after their introduction from the Americas. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, beets. These could be stored under suitable conditions. Cabbage could be preserved. Beans could be dried. Fruit could be dried. Meat could be salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved. The winter pantry was essentially a survival system. A household that had successfully preserved food could enter winter with some confidence. A household that had failed faced a much more uncertain season. Winter was not equally difficult for everyone. Wealth made an enormous difference. A wealthy household might have thick walls, multiple fireplaces, large stores of food, good quality clothing, wool blankets, servants to collect wood, and rooms designed for comfort. A poor family might have a small house, limited fuel, simple clothing, few food reserves, and little protection from drafts. For poor families, winter could be genuinely dangerous. Fuel was expensive or difficult to collect. Food prices could rise. Illness could spread. And cold weather made every weakness more serious. This is important to remember when we romanticize historical winter life. There was beauty in the firelight. There was comfort in family gatherings. But there was also hardship. Winter could expose the difference between those who had enough and those who did not. In many communities, forests were extremely important. Wood was needed for heating, cooking, construction, tools, fences, and many other purposes. This meant that access to forests could become a major social and economic issue. Who was allowed to collect wood? Who owned the forest? Could villagers gather fallen branches? Could they cut trees? In some places, communities had traditional rights to collect fuel. In other places, authorities controlled access. A poor household might therefore depend heavily on local customs. Even a small pile of branches could matter. And when winter was severe, people became especially careful with fuel. A tree was not just a tree. It was potentially months of warmth. There was never one universal method of surviving winter. People adapted to their environment. In Northern Europe, homes and clothing reflected long cold seasons. In Scandinavia, wood and later improved stoves played major roles. In parts of Russia and Eastern Europe, massive masonry stoves could become central features of homes. In the British Isles, fireplaces were essential. In colonial North America, settlers adapted European techniques to local materials and climates. Indigenous peoples across North America developed their own sophisticated methods for dealing with cold environments using local materials, clothing, shelters, food systems, and knowledge of the land. The key lesson is simple. Humans are remarkably adaptable. There is no single perfect winter house. There is only the house that works in your environment. One of the cleverest developments in heating technology was the masonry stove. Unlike a simple open fireplace, a masonry stove could store heat. The fire heated a large mass of brick, stone, or other material. That material then released warmth gradually. This was extremely useful. Instead of burning wood continuously, you could heat the structure and allow it to radiate warmth for hours. Different designs appeared in different regions. Some became enormous. Some included channels that directed hot gases through the structure before they escaped. The result was a heating system that could be much more efficient than an open hearth. It was an early example of something modern engineers still care about. Energy efficiency. Use as much of the fuel's energy as possible. Waste as little heat as possible. People did not have modern thermodynamics textbooks, but through experience, they discovered useful principles. Another important idea was draft control. Cold air moving through a house could make the interior feel much colder. So people blocked gaps. They used cloth, straw, clay, mud, wood, and other materials. Doors could be covered. Windows could be shuttered. Walls could be repaired. Roofs could be maintained. Sometimes a thick layer of snow on a roof could even provide some insulation. Snow itself contains trapped air, and trapped air can slow heat transfer. This does not mean people deliberately covered every house in snow, but in some environments, snow became part of the landscape of winter architecture. The outside world became a blanket of white. The house sat quietly underneath it. For agricultural families, animals were part of winter survival. Cattle, sheep, goats, horses, chickens. Different animals had different needs. Some animals were kept indoors or in sheltered structures during the coldest periods. Others remained outside when conditions allowed. Animal feed had to be stored. Hay became extremely important. A farmer who failed to prepare enough feed could lose valuable livestock. And livestock were not just property. They were part of the household economy. Cows could provide milk. Sheep provided wool. Animals could provide meat. Horses could provide transportation. So protecting animals during winter protected the entire household. In some traditional buildings, living spaces and animal spaces were deliberately positioned close together. This arrangement had another possible benefit. Animals produced heat. The warm air from livestock could slightly raise temperatures in connected structures. Again, the principle was simple. Use whatever warmth is available. Let's return to clothing. One of the simplest ways people protected themselves was through layering. Instead of relying on one garment, they combined several. The air trapped between layers helped provide insulation. Wool was especially useful. It remained warm even when slightly damp. This made it valuable in wet and cold climates. Outer garments protected against wind and rain. Inner layers helped retain body heat. Hats protected the head. Scarves or cloth could protect the neck. Gloves protected the hands. And footwear protected the feet from cold ground and snow. The exact clothing varied enormously by region, but the basic idea was universal. Your body is producing heat. Clothing helps prevent that heat from disappearing too quickly. Modern outdoor clothing uses the same basic principle. The materials have changed. The engineering has improved. But the underlying idea is ancient. Now imagine a typical winter morning. The sun has not fully risen. The room is cold. You wake beneath several layers of bedding. Your breath is visible in the air. For a few seconds, you don't want to leave the bed. This feeling would have been familiar to many generations of people. Getting out of bed meant leaving the warmest place in the house. You sit up. The cold immediately becomes noticeable. You dress quickly. Perhaps you move toward the fire. If the fire has gone out, someone has to restart it. Water may need to be carried. Food needs to be prepared. Animals need attention. And eventually, the day begins. There is something strangely familiar about this. Even though the world is completely different, the human reaction to cold remains the same. We want warmth. We want comfort. We want to stay under the blanket. By afternoon, the house may be more comfortable. The sun provides some natural warmth. Work continues. If the weather is reasonable, people go outside. If snow is deep or storms are severe, they may stay indoors. The winter afternoon can be quiet. A family member might repair clothing. Someone might carve wood. Someone might prepare food. Someone might tell a story. Children might play. And gradually, the light outside begins to disappear. Winter evenings return. The fire becomes important again, and the cycle continues. Most winter days were not disasters. People lived with cold because they had to. But occasionally, weather became extreme. A prolonged freeze could damage crops. Heavy snowfall could block roads. A storm could destroy buildings. Livestock could die. Food stores could become dangerously low. And if winter continued longer than expected, the situation could become desperate. Historical records from different periods describe severe winters, crop failures, frozen rivers, and difficult travel. But it is important to remember that weather varied enormously by place and year. Not every winter was catastrophic. Some were mild. Some were harsh. Some were simply long. The challenge was uncertainty. People could prepare, but they could never completely control nature. Travel was another challenge. Modern transportation makes winter seem relatively manageable. A car can cross a snowy road. A train can travel through a frozen landscape. An airplane can cross an entire continent. Earlier travelers had much fewer options. Roads could become muddy. Snow could cover paths. Rivers could freeze. Bridges could become dangerous. Horses needed food and shelter. Travelers needed warm clothing. And long journeys required planning. People carried food. They searched for inns. They relied on villages. They watched the weather. And sometimes, they simply waited. A snowstorm could delay a journey for days. The best decision might be to stay inside. In a world where communication was slow, being stranded could be frightening. For travelers, an inn could feel like paradise. Imagine walking through snow for hours. Your clothes are cold. Your hands are tired. The sky is dark. Then you see a small light, a warm glow from a window. You open the door. Warm air reaches your face. You hear voices. You smell food. You see a fire. For someone who had been outside in winter, that little room could feel incredibly luxurious. A hot meal, a place to sit, a bed, a fire. Sometimes the simplest comforts feel greatest when you have gone without them. Children also learned winter habits. They learned how to dress, how to stay near the fire, how to avoid wasting fuel, how to carry wood, how to recognize dangerous weather. And winter could still be fun. Snow provided opportunities for play. Children could slide down hills, build simple snow structures, play games, and spend long evenings indoors. Perhaps one of the most beautiful aspects of winter was storytelling. When darkness arrived early, people had more time to sit together. And when there was no television, people became the entertainment. Stories were passed from person to person. Some were funny, some were frightening, some were religious, some were about ancestors, some were completely imaginary. The storyteller became the center of attention. The fire flickered. The wind moved outside. Everyone listened. And then, the story ended. Another person began. This is something humans have done for thousands of years. Winter simply gave them more time to do it. Eventually, the fire became quieter. The conversations became slower. People became tired. One by one, they went to bed. The house became dark. Perhaps only a few embers remained. The temperature dropped. But inside the bedding, there was warmth. The human body created its own little pocket of heat. Blankets trapped it. Curtains blocked drafts. People slept close together. Outside, the snow continued falling. The village became quiet. And somewhere beneath the darkness, another winter night passed. Winter did more than change temperature. It changed people's sense of time. Summer days were long. Winter days were short. This affected work, social life, travel, sleep, and mood. The seasons created a rhythm. People knew that winter would eventually end. The days would become longer. Snow would disappear. Fields would become green. But until then, they waited. This waiting was part of winter. The cold season demanded patience. After a long winter night, morning eventually arrived. But winter mornings were different from summer mornings. The sun appeared late. The air inside the house could still be cold. And outside, the landscape might be completely white. Before anyone could begin the day, the fire often needed attention. A few glowing embers remained beneath the ash. Someone would carefully move the ash aside, add dry wood, and wait. At first, there might be only a tiny glow, then a small flame, and slowly, the fire returned. This simple act was repeated countless times throughout history. Every morning began with the same quiet task: bring the fire back to life. And as the room slowly warmed, the household began to wake. Even the ashes from the fire could be useful. People in earlier societies were often careful with resources because very little could simply be thrown away. Wood ash could have practical uses. It could be used in certain household processes. It could be spread around areas where appropriate. It could become part of traditional methods for cleaning or making certain materials. Nothing was completely useless. The remains of yesterday's fire could have a purpose today. This was especially important during winter. When resources were limited, waste became expensive. A family that carefully managed everything had a better chance of making its supplies last. The kitchen was often one of the warmest places in a home. Cooking created heat. A large pot could remain near the fire for hours. Bread could be baked. Soup could simmer. Water could be heated. And while food was being prepared, the surrounding room became more comfortable. This meant that winter cooking was not simply about making meals. It was also part of the household heating routine. People naturally gathered where useful work and warmth happened at the same time. A person might sit beside the cooking fire while repairing clothing. Someone else might prepare vegetables. Another person might tell a story. The kitchen became a place where warmth, food, work, and conversation came together. Today, warm water is something most people barely think about. Turn a tap, and there it is. For earlier people, heating water required fuel and time. Water had to be carried, a container had to be filled, the fire had to be burning, and then the water had to be heated. Because of this, hot water was valuable. It could be used for cooking, cleaning, washing, and sometimes simply for comfort. On a cold winter day, even warm water on your hands could feel wonderful. The experience of warmth was much more noticeable when creating it required effort. A successful winter household needed organization. Food could not simply be placed anywhere. Some foods needed to stay dry. Some needed cooler conditions. Some needed protection from animals. Some needed to be preserved carefully. The pantry or storage area therefore became an important part of the home. Shelves could hold jars and containers. Sacks could hold grain. Roots could be stored in suitable spaces. Hanging foods could be protected from moisture. The pantry represented security. Every stored item meant one less thing the household had to find outside. And during a storm, that mattered. You could remain indoors because the food was already there. Winter could change the landscape completely. A familiar road could disappear beneath snow. A small stream could freeze. A muddy path could become difficult to cross. A village that was easy to reach in summer could suddenly feel isolated. This meant communities had to become more self-reliant during winter. People could not always depend on visitors. They could not always travel to the nearest market. They had to depend on what they had already stored. This was another reason preparation mattered so much. Winter reduced movement. And when movement became difficult, stored resources became more important. Imagine standing outside a small village on a winter evening. There are no engines, no traffic, no airplanes overhead, no electric signs glowing in the distance. Instead, you might hear the wind, the sound of footsteps on frozen ground, a wooden door opening, an animal moving inside a stable, perhaps the distant sound of someone chopping wood. Then, silence again. The village might look almost empty. But behind the walls, people were living ordinary lives, eating, working, talking, preparing for tomorrow. Winter made the outside world quiet, while life continued inside. Beside many winter homes, there was one thing that mattered enormously: a woodpile. It might look simple, just stacks of logs. But to the people living inside the house, that pile represented warmth. Each piece of wood had a future purpose. This log might heat breakfast. That log might keep the room warm in the afternoon. Another might be needed during the night. The size of the woodpile could therefore tell you something about how prepared a household was. A large supply brought confidence. A small supply created anxiety. During a long winter, people watched their woodpile slowly become smaller. And every time another log went into the fire, a little piece of their future warmth disappeared. Perhaps the most important skill was simply learning how to avoid unnecessary cold. Close the door. Cover the window. Wear another layer. Stay near the fire. Don't sit directly on cold stone. Keep your feet dry. Don't waste fuel. Don't leave warm rooms unnecessarily. These sound like simple ideas, but when repeated every day, they became a way of life. People became experts at managing small differences in temperature. They noticed drafts. They noticed damp clothing. They noticed which corner of a room was warmest. They understood their homes through experience. Their knowledge was practical and often passed from one generation to another. Every house had its own geography of warmth. One corner might be close to the fireplace. Another might be protected from the wind. A certain seat might be warmer than the others. A particular sleeping place might be especially comfortable. People knew these places. They didn't need a thermometer. Their bodies told them. The warmest chair might naturally become someone's favorite place during winter. Someone would sit there while reading. Someone else would work there. Children might gather around it. The same little corner could become part of family memory. Years later, people might still remember where they used to sit beside the fire. Cold weather was not kind to clothing. Fabric could tear. Shoes could become damaged. Wool could wear thin. And replacing clothing was expensive. So winter was also a season of repair. A small tear could be stitched. A worn section could be patched. A sock could be repaired. A coat could receive another layer. People learned to extend the life of everything they owned. This created another kind of winter skill, the ability to make old things useful again. A damaged garment was not necessarily thrown away. It could be repaired and continue protecting someone from the cold. As evening arrived, firelight became the center of the home. There is something unusual about firelight. It does not illuminate a room evenly. Instead, it creates islands of light. The area around the fire is visible. The walls glow. The corners remain dark. Shadows move whenever the flames move. For people who lived before electric lighting, this was normal. Night was genuinely dark. And perhaps because of this, winter evenings had a different rhythm. People did not stare at screens. They watched the fire. They listened to one another. They worked with their hands. They talked. And eventually, they became sleepy. Without modern clocks and electric lights, the seasons influenced daily life strongly. People woke with the morning, worked during daylight, returned home as darkness approached, and rested when the day was finished. Winter compressed the amount of usable daylight. This meant that evenings arrived earlier. The household slowed down. The fire became more important. And sleep could arrive naturally. The darkness itself was a signal. The day was ending. There was no need for a bright screen to remind anyone. Outside was dark. Inside was quiet. It was time to rest. One of the most powerful feelings during winter must have been the feeling of being indoors. Outside, the weather could be unpredictable. Inside, there were walls, a roof, a fire, food, blankets, family. The contrast could be enormous. Imagine returning home after walking through snow. You close the wooden door behind you. The wind disappears. You remove your wet outer clothing. Someone places another log on the fire. The room is still not perfectly warm, but it is warm enough. You sit down. A bowl of hot food arrives, and suddenly, the outside world feels very far away. The house becomes a small island of safety. But sometimes, the fire went out. Perhaps the wood was too damp. Perhaps someone forgot to add another log. Perhaps the household was trying to save fuel. Whatever the reason, the result was immediate. The room slowly became colder. The walls remained cold. The furniture became cold. The floor became cold. And everyone noticed. Restarting the fire could become a priority. This is something modern people rarely experience. We can lose electricity for a while and still remain surrounded by many sources of stored comfort. Earlier people were much more directly dependent on fire. When the fire disappeared, the difference could be felt almost immediately. The hardest part of winter was not always the coldest day. Sometimes it was the length. One cold day could be managed, but weeks of cold, followed by more cold, could become exhausting. The same grey sky, the same frozen ground, the same short days, the same need for firewood, the same careful food storage, the same thick clothing. People waited for change, but winter did not hurry. It moved slowly, day after day, night after night, until eventually, the first signs of spring appeared. Perhaps one morning, the snow began to soften. Perhaps the sunlight felt slightly different. Perhaps water began moving beneath the ice. Perhaps a bird returned. Small changes, almost invisible. But people noticed. After months of winter, even a tiny sign of spring could feel significant. The days became longer. The fire was needed for fewer hours. The doors could remain open a little longer. People could spend more time outside. And slowly, winter began to release its grip. Modern heating has changed our relationship with winter. We rarely think about fuel. We rarely think about insulation. We rarely think about how much wood is needed to keep a room warm. We simply set the temperature, and the room changes. This is an incredible achievement, but it has also made warmth feel ordinary. Earlier, people experienced warmth as something precious. They knew where it came from. They knew how much effort it required. They knew how quickly it could disappear. A warm room was not automatic. It was created, maintained, protected, and appreciated. The story of winter survival is ultimately a story about adaptation. Humans lived in deserts, mountains, forests, frozen regions, coastal areas, and everything between them. They used whatever materials were available. They learned from previous generations. They changed their homes. They changed their clothing. They changed their diets. They changed their routines. And they survived. Not because winter was easy, but because humans learned how to live with it. So, before we finish our journey, let's return one final time to a small home on a winter night. Imagine that it is several centuries ago. There are no streetlights outside. There are no cars passing along the road. There is no distant glow from a modern city. The village is almost completely dark. Snow covers the rooftops. The trees stand quietly beneath the cold night sky. A little smoke rises from one chimney and disappears into the darkness. Inside one of the houses, a small fire is still burning. It is not a huge fire. It does not fill the room with bright light. Instead, it glows quietly. Orange light moves across the wooden walls. The shadows change whenever a piece of wood shifts. Someone has already gone to sleep. Another person is preparing the final things before bed. The doors are closed. The windows are covered. The animals are sheltered. The food for tomorrow has already been prepared. And for tonight, there is nothing left to do. The house can finally become quiet. Near the fireplace, there is one final piece of wood. It has been saved for the night. Someone carefully places it onto the fire. The flames rise for a moment. The room becomes brighter. Then slowly, the fire settles. The log begins to glow. This simple moment would have been familiar to countless generations. A final piece of wood. A final burst of warmth. And then, sleep. For people without modern heating, managing the fire was part of managing the night. Too little fire, and the room became uncomfortable. Too much, and valuable fuel was wasted. The goal was balance. Enough warmth to sleep comfortably. Enough fuel to last until morning. The fire was not simply something burning in the corner. It was part of the rhythm of the household. Eventually, everyone is asleep. The house becomes almost completely silent. There may still be small sounds. The gentle movement of the fire, a piece of wood cracking, the wind passing around the roof, an animal moving outside. But otherwise, silence. This kind of silence is difficult to experience today. Modern life rarely becomes completely quiet. There are always distant sounds, traffic, machines, phones, heating systems, air conditioners, electronic devices. But hundreds of years ago, a winter night could become remarkably still. And perhaps that silence helped people sleep. Outside, snow continues to fall. Snow is strangely quiet. It covers the ground. It covers rooftops. It softens footsteps. It absorbs some of the ordinary sounds of the landscape. The village becomes even quieter. A person looking through a small window might see almost nothing, only darkness and pale snow. The world appears frozen in place, but inside the house, life continues. A fire burns, people breathe, animals rest, and somewhere beneath the blankets, someone dreams. Inside the bed, the cold outside becomes distant. The blankets hold the warmth produced by the body. The mattress separates the sleeper from the cold floor. The curtains, if there are any, reduce drafts. And slowly, the body becomes comfortable. This was perhaps one of the simplest forms of heating in human history. Your own body creates heat. The challenge is keeping that heat close. Blankets help. Clothing helps. Shelter helps. Another person sleeping nearby helps. The human body becomes part of its own heating system. And after a long winter day, sleep becomes welcome. We cannot know exactly what people dreamed about centuries ago, but we can imagine the subjects that filled their thoughts before sleep. Tomorrow's work, the weather, the harvest, the animals, the family, the coming spring. Perhaps someone wondered whether the firewood would last. Perhaps someone thought about a journey. Perhaps a child dreamed about playing outside once the snow disappeared. The mind continued working, even after the body became still. Outside, the winter night continued. Inside, dreams carried people somewhere else. Eventually, morning would return. The sky would slowly become lighter. The darkness would disappear. The fire might need to be restarted. Breakfast would need to be prepared. Animals would need attention. The doors would open, and another day would begin. This cycle repeated throughout the winter. Night, morning, work, food, fire, sleep. Then again, night. People did not need to think about the entire winter at once. They simply lived one day at a time. One cold morning, one warm meal, one evening beside the fire, one night beneath the blankets, and slowly, the season passed. Perhaps winter's greatest lesson was patience. You could not make spring arrive faster. You could not stop the snow. You could not control the temperature. You could only prepare and wait. This required a different relationship with time. People had to accept that some things were outside their control. The cold would come. The snow would fall. The days would become short. And eventually, the season would end. Winter demanded patience, and patience became part of survival. Much of this knowledge was passed down through families. Older people knew things younger people had not yet learned. They knew which wood burned well. They knew how to store food. They knew how to recognize dangerous weather. They knew where drafts entered the house. They knew how much fuel might be needed. They knew which clothing needed repair. They knew when animals needed extra protection. This knowledge was not always written down. It lived in people's memories. A grandmother might teach a child how to prepare food. A grandfather might teach a young person how to split wood. Parents taught children what their parents had taught them. Generation after generation, winter knowledge continued. A single family could prepare for winter, but a community could do much more. People could help one another.